The largest explosion in the history of spaceflight happened on July 3, 1969, 14 days before Apollo 11. The blast was visible from the horizon. It shattered windows kilometers away. Witnesses said it looked like a small nuclear bomb had gone off, and by morning, the Soviet Union had erased it from history. That explosion is what we're building toward, and I promise you, by the end of this video, when I finally show you what actually happened that night in Kazakhstan, your jaw will drop. Because the cover-up wasn't just about hiding a failure, it was about hiding the fact that the Soviets were this close to beating America to the moon. But before we get there, quick question. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious whether people are catching this at 2 a.m. or on their lunch break, because this story is the kind of thing you're going to want to tell someone the second it's over. Now, let's go back to the beginning. May 1961. John F. Kennedy stands in front of Congress and tells America it's going to the moon before the end of the decade. At that point, the total time any American had spent in space was roughly 15 minutes. The Soviets weren't scared. They were already ahead. First satellite in orbit, first animal in orbit, first human in orbit. They looked at Kennedy's speech and they thought, this is a bluff. That was their first mistake. For 3 years, the Soviet leadership watched the American program ramp up and did almost nothing. The man running their space program, a genius engineer named Sergei Korolev, had been begging for a moon rocket since 1956, but the Kremlin kept saying no. The military needed missiles, the civilian program was for propaganda, and you don't need a moon rocket to win a propaganda war. Then, August 1964 happened. The Soviets finally took the Americans seriously. They finally authorized a manned lunar landing program, and the decree was signed 2 months before the leader who signed it got removed from power. They were already 3 years behind, and the clock was running. Korolev threw himself into the work. He had a rocket design he'd been developing for years, something called the N-1. It stood taller than a 30-story building. Its first stage burned liquid oxygen and kerosene, and it needed enormous thrust to get off the ground. The only problem was the engines. Here's where the story gets genuinely strange. To build the engines for the most important rocket in Soviet history, Korolev refused to use the country's best rocket engine designer. His name was Valentin Glushko, and Korolev wouldn't go near him because 25 years earlier, during Stalin's purges, Glushko had signed a document denouncing him. Korolev had spent over a year in a Siberian labor camp because of it, working in the death mines. He never forgot. So instead of Glushko, he went to a man named Nikolai Kuznetsov. Brilliant engineer, had spent his entire career building jet engines for bombers, had never built a large rocket engine in his life. Kuznetsov agreed to try. The engine he built was called the NK-15. Clever design, efficient, produced about 150 tons of thrust. And here's the thing, the N-1 needed 30 of them, all firing at the same time, all synchronized, never once tested together on the ground, because there was no money to build a test stand big enough. The first time all 30 engines would fire would be on the actual launch pad. Let that sink in. A small Soviet institute was quietly assigned to calculate the actual probability that the first N-1 launch would succeed. They looked at the failure record of every Soviet rocket ever built. They ran the numbers honestly. The result came back at just over 1%. 1%. The man running the institute knew he couldn't walk into a room full of generals and cosmonauts and say that out loud. So he told his team to run it again. This time, only counting failures caused by unknown physics. Manufacturing defects don't count. Human error doesn't count. Only things nobody could have predicted. The new number was 67%. He presented that one. The room still went silent. And then, because there was no time and the Americans were coming and Apollo 8 had just looped around the moon, they voted. Not on whether the engineering was ready, on whether each chief designer personally believed his system would work.
Nobody said no. Nobody could afford to. They launched anyway. February 21st, 1969. 44 degrees below zero on the steppe. Wind strong enough to knock a man off his feet. The countdown hit zero. The 30 engines built up thrust over 12 long seconds, and the N1 rose off the pad on a column of fire and black smoke. For 68 seconds, it looked like it was working. Then a small pressure pipe inside one engine snapped from vibration. Fuel leaked into the tail compartment. Fire started. The fire burned through the wiring of the automated engine control system, which sent false distress signals to the computer. The computer read those signals, concluded that every single engine on the rocket had simultaneously failed, and shut them all down at once. The rocket had not actually failed. The system designed to save it had killed it. It crashed 52 kilometers from the pad in the snow. The Soviets said nothing. Officially, it had never happened. Now we have to talk about what happened 3 months later, because this is the part they buried deepest. By the summer of 1969, Korolev was already dead. He had died on an operating table in January of 1966 during routine surgery that turned out not to be routine at all. His body, worn down by years in the labor camps, gave out at 59 years old. His replacement was a man named Vasily Mishin, competent, careful, but without Korolev's fire, without his political instincts, without his ability to drag resources out of a reluctant state. The Americans were accelerating. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. Apollo 10 flew it to within 15 kilometers of the surface. Apollo 11 was scheduled for July. The Soviets had one card left. If the second N1 launched in early July and worked, they could at least send an unmanned probe around the moon. Not a landing, not a win, but something, a way to muddy the story. The second rocket, Vehicle 5L, was rolled to the pad in late June. The engineers were cautiously optimistic. They had made fixes. They had moved the control system away from the engine compartment. They had added ventilation. They had installed filters to keep metal debris out of the fuel lines. The launch was set for the night of July 3rd, 1969.
This is the moment I told you we were building toward. A quarter of a second after the engines reached full thrust, a tiny piece of metallic debris entered an oxidizer pump. The pump exploded. Fire erupted at the base of the rocket as it rose past the top of the launch tower. The control system this time responded correctly, shutting down engines in pairs, but it was too late. The thrust dropped below the weight of the vehicle. The rocket slowed, leveled off, and then began falling backward, tilted at 45 degrees, straight back down onto the launch pad it had just left. The escape tower at the very top fired and pulled the empty crew capsule clear. Everything else hit the ground. The explosion that followed was one of the largest non-nuclear blasts ever recorded. Witnesses compared it to a small atomic detonation. The shockwave shattered windows kilometers away. The launch pad, which had taken years to construct, became a crater. The damage was so complete that it would take 18 months just to repair the site. 14 days later, Apollo 11 landed on the moon. At almost the exact same moment, a small Soviet robot probe called Luna 15 launched as a desperate backup plan to scoop up moon rocks and bring them back before Armstrong could, attempted its landing. It crashed into a region of the moon called the Sea of Crises. The metaphor writes itself. And then came the burial. The footage of the explosion was classified. The records were sealed. The launch pad was disguised as best it could be from satellite cameras. The entire program was declared officially non-existent. The Soviet policy was simple. There was no moon program. There never had been. The N1 was either a research vehicle, a satellite launcher, or simply a thing that did not exist, depending on which press release you were reading. The cover-up worked so completely that by 1974, American news anchors were telling their audiences on national television that the Soviets had never even tried to reach the moon. Respected newspapers said the same thing throughout the 1970s. The entire space race was reframed as a NASA invention, a story cooked up to pry money out of Congress. By the time the decade ended, the official Western narrative was that there had never really been a contest at all. None of those journalists were lying. They just didn't know what had happened in the snow in Kazakhstan.
The Soviets had buried the failure so completely that the people who had won started to doubt there had ever been a competition. 2 more N-1 rockets flew after that. Both failed. 2 fully assembled, improved rockets sat in the hangar ready to go and were quietly dismantled. The engines ended up in a sealed warehouse. 20 years later, an American company bought them, tested them, found that they worked. Those same engines, from the program that officially never existed, eventually flew on American rockets in the 21st century. The cosmonauts who had trained for the lunar mission, men who had spent years studying moon geology and practicing landing simulations, were told year after year that the next launch would be the one. The training group was dissolved in 1973. None of them ever went to the moon. Most of what they said about it afterward was guarded. They had spent a decade preparing for a mission that, as far as the rest of the world knew, had never been planned. The launch complexes at Baikonur are crumbling now. The assembly building roof has caved in. Tumbleweed grows through the abandoned equipment. A few engines sit in museums. A handful of lander prototypes survive in research institutes across Russia. Small spacecraft, about 5 meters tall, designed to carry 1 man to the surface of the moon. None of them ever flew with a person inside. The film footage of all 4 launches was finally released in the late 1980s, after the Soviet Union began to fall apart. It is grainy. It is silent. It shows a very large rocket rising into a very clear sky and then falling back down. 4 separate times, 4 separate years, in a country that no longer exists. What strikes you watching it is this: those rockets don't know they're about to fail. They rise with total confidence. The flames are bright. The smoke trails are clean. For the first 60 seconds, or 50 seconds, or 107 seconds, you genuinely cannot tell the difference between a rocket that is going to the moon and a rocket that is going to come apart. That is what the Soviets were really hiding. Not just the explosions, the fact that until the very last second, the explosions looked exactly like success. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who would enjoy the next one. Subscribe, because the next story is just as buried as this one.